leading right up to winter and the winter break, we were discussing prophecies and indications from the Old Testament about the impending arrival of the Messiah. And after winter break, we kind of used that break as a way to kind of catapult us into the actual life of Jesus and the things that he was doing to fulfill the prophecies that were made about him back in the Old Testament days. So last week we talked about the Sermon on the Mount, and this week we're going to be talking about the kingdom of heaven as described by Jesus in parables. First, we need to kind of determine which kingdom of heaven we're talking about. We're not talking about the movie. It was a kind of a well-acted movie, but when you put Jerusalem on a ridge in front of a major plain, you know that they weren't geography students when they made the movie. Was it the new city of Jerusalem described in Revelations? No, we're not talking about that one either. Although as I was looking for a stock photograph of what that kingdom is supposed to look like, I came across a picture, I should have probably put it up there, of what, when they describe, I think it was Revelation chapter 26, I know it was in Revelation, the size of the New Jerusalem. 1,560 miles cubed. The thing could take up most of the United States. I mean, they actually had a picture of it on a globe to scale. And it covered everything from western Nevada to Florida. Just like, because you think, when we get to heaven, hopefully get to this kingdom, we're not the only righteous people by any stretch of the imagination that are going to be there. There's a lot of people that are going to be filling that place up, and it's good to know that God was true to his word, and there's going to be enough room for a mansion for every one of us. The Roman province of Judea. No, and this is where the Judeans that were contemporaries of Christ really kind of got their wires crossed. The teaching about Messiah in the Old Testament coming forward was that he was going to be a conquering Messiah. He was going to be out of the lineage of David. He was going to kick all of the foreigners out of the land of Judea. He was going to reestablish the nation of Israel as a major power in the Middle East, and he was going to start a whole new dynasty going forward here on earth, and he was going to make his kingdom among men. And from their perspective, that's what they were expecting, but that's not what they got. So before we get into this, why do you think, we're going to get a little bit further into it in a few slides, but I wanted to kind of cover this now because it's on my mind. Why do you think that Christ would talk about the kingdom of heaven in parables? I know that for me personally, when I was a wee lad, I was raised in the church and left the church. I was probably 15, 16 years old, right after I was baptized, actually. I ended up having some issues with that church, and my father did too. I was out of the church 15 years and had gone from being 15 years old to the next time I stepped foot voluntarily into a church building, I was 31, 32. And I had told, God, because the church that I went to was like right maybe 3 blocks from the apartment building where my wife and I lived. And I kept driving back and forth in front of it. And one day my wife was out of town on business, and I said, okay, God, I'm going to give you one last chance. If the church I walk into today is going to be as bad as all of the rest of the churches I've walked into, I'm never darkening the doorstep of a Church of Christ again. I walked in there, and God grabbed me by the hair of the head and rang me like a bell. And I got home that day, and my wife returned, I think the following Friday from the business trip that she was on. And I told her that I was going to be going to this church for the foreseeable future, and this is something, that she needed to kind of get used to. And I felt a little bad about it, because this was something I sprang on her. This wasn't part of the package, with the game of life that we've been in the mornings. This wasn't part of the package when she got into the car with me. And she said, okay, I don't have any problems with this. We can work with it. After 2 weeks, she told me she was ready to call in a cult deprogrammer because I had joined a cult. My behavior had changed so much. Before I started going back to church again, I was in the Army, and my wife said she was consistently amazed at the number of conversations I could have with people that consisted of inflections on one word. And language, as much as is possible, I still backslide from time to time. Cleaned up. Behavior, as much as I can. Cleaned up. God established through Christ a new relationship with me in the kingdom of heaven, his kingdom. So, having said all of that, how do you explain that to someone that expects an earthly king to come down, take over the entire area, set himself up in a palace, and rule as the first king of a new dynasty in Jerusalem and Judea? So it's one of those things where, with the kingdom of heaven being inside us, with that direct relationship that we have with our king, and we're all Americans here. We've got the vices of our virtues. We are Americans as Americans because 200 and some odd years ago, a bunch of the guys that were running this part of Great Britain developed a deathly allergy to kings, particularly faraway kings. So it's hard to wrap your brain as an American around wanting to worship a king, but we do it, right? So this kingdom that I'm a member of, that you all are members of, was instituted by Christ here on earth. And so we ended out having Christ trying to get a point what the kingdom of heaven was like to a certain extent through some of the parables that we're going to be seeing today. See, I'm going to have to get moving. And there's an interlude between the parable of the sower and the parable of the seed in Matthew 13:10-17, and in Matthew 13:34-35, where Jesus is even going to talk about why he's doing some of this. But before we go, we should probably define what a parable actually is. This is the best definition that I could find and come up with on my own. An educational story that uses a simile to compare something known to something unknown. Jackson, what's a simile? Come on, some of you guys had to have gone to English class back in school. They talk about this stuff. A simile is a comparison of two things by declaring their similarities. Really is kind of about the best way to put that. So, parables sometimes got bonus points if they weren't as obvious as you might have thought they should have been, or if they made you think, and even extra bonus points if they were designed to hide information from people who weren't ready necessarily to hear the story or hear the message that they were putting out. So, depending on who does the counting, there were roughly 50-ish parables, and also kind of depending on how you define what a parable actually is. There are around 50-ish that Jesus actually gave or said or preached during his ministry, and it was his preferred way of teaching. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 34, the author goes so far as to say that Jesus only used parables when teaching the crowds. And he fulfilled prophecy by teaching in parables. Jesus' use of parables was in and of itself a fulfillment of prophecy from Psalms chapter 78, verse 2. And of the 5 parables we're going to be talking about today, 3 are explicitly agricultural, with the other 2 referencing common knowledge, which makes perfect sense when you think that Christ was speaking to a largely rural, largely agricultural, population. If you're going to talk to somebody that, 20 years ago was a farmer here in Kansas, you're not going to use a parable that features computers and integrated circuits to make him understand what you're talking about. The similes have to be something that the listener has some experience with. So back to the parables about the kingdom of heaven. Even though we just said that in many ways parables were used by Jesus to hide the truth from those who weren't actively seeking it, the actual literal meanings of 2 of the 4 parables were handed down to us in the Gospels. Stop sticking. Okay, so the first one's the parable of the sower. On that day, after Jesus went out of the house, he sat by the lake. And such a large crowd gathered around him that he had to get out in a boat to sit while the whole crowd stood on the shore. He told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. As he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil. They sprang up quickly because the soil was not deep. But when the sun came up, they were scorched. And because they did not have sufficient root, they withered. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and they grew up and choked them. But other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100 times as much, some 60, some 30. The one who has ears had better listen." Immediately after finishing that parable, the disciples walked over and asked Jesus why he was speaking in parables. The answer was that he was explicitly making a link back to the Old Testament, in this case Isaiah chapter 6, verses 9 through 10. And we talked about, if you want to know Jesus, go to Isaiah during the Lord's Supper today. As we have in modern times, a good chunk of his audience listened to that parable and started to either ignore it or overthink it or try to just look with a blank look. These people were just not willing to receive the gospel on the gospel's terms. Instead, they tried to process it and make it all about them, not about the disciples, and certainly not about Jesus. So because their hearts weren't open, Jesus said, "And concerning them, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, 'You will listen carefully, yet you'll never understand. You will look closely, yet will never comprehend. For the heart of this people has become dull. They are hard of hearing. They have shut their eyes so that they would not see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts, so that I in turn would heal them.'" Then, in verses 18 through 23, Jesus actually spells what this parable out is all about. So listen to the parable of the sower. "When anyone hears the word about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches what was sown in his heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed sown on the rocky ground is the person who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy, but he has no root in himself and does not endure. So when troubles or persecution come because of the word, immediately he falls away. The seed sown among the thorns is the person who hears the word, but worldly cares and the seductiveness of the wealth choke the word, so it produces nothing. But as far as the seed sown on good soil, this is the person who hears the word and understands. He bears fruit, yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown." The next parable also dealt with agriculture. In it, noxious weeds get mixed into a field of wheat. He presented them with another parable. "The kingdom of heaven is like a person who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, an enemy came and sowed darnel among the wheat and went away. When the plants sprouted and produced grain, the darnel also appeared. So the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field?' 'Then where did the darnel come from?' He said, 'An enemy has done this.' So the slaves replied, 'Do you want us to go and gather it?' But he said, 'No. Since in gathering the darnel you may uproot the wheat along with it. Let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I will tell the reapers, first collect the darnel and tie it in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn.'" So, the interesting thing about this is a specific weed that Jesus is describing here. that is a picture of wheat on your right and darnel on the left. I don't know if you can look or see that closely, but with some of the pictures that I was able to find, I could easily see how those would look closely enough alike that you'd not be able to really tell the difference until they sprouted, or until the seeds actually started to appear. And even better is that darnel, in addition to not being wheat, is actually actively poisonous to people. And it was so nasty. Now, how nasty? How nasty, I hear everybody ask. How nasty? Well, it was so nasty that the Romans, who were generally okay with things like scourging, crucifying prisoners, beheading and torturing others to death, said it is against the law to sow someone's field with this, to do actually what was described right in this parable. It's illegal. It was even too much for the Romans. So I've mentioned several times that as I've spoken that I came from an agricultural background as a child. My sister and I worked our grandparents' farm all summer, every summer, until I was about 14 or so. And I thought some about this, and here's another set of plants that may be a little familiar to some of the folks in here, since darnel is not really native to the area. Did those not make it in? Whoops. No, they didn't. Well, I won't compare them then. So there was a particular type of thistle that when it first starts to sprout, looks exactly like just sprouted watermelon plants. And it was our job to go ahead and hoe the watermelon fields, among other things. And, we never really, as a kid, the last thing you want to do is to kill a watermelon. So we always used to actually wait until those plants got about yay high or so, then they start sprouting thorns. You could see which ones were the weeds, and then you could go ahead and kill them. So in this parable, Jesus does the same thing with a slightly different motive. First, note that first century agricultural engineers did not have the benefit of John Deere tractors or GPS. They sowed their fields by walking from one end of the field to the other, spreading seed, kind of about a 6-foot arc. They just grab seed out of the sack. So there were no real rows, and it was kind of a chaotic, it was chaotic plants coming up everywhere, instead of the neat rows that you think about when you see modern agriculture. So the plants were all just jumbled in together, and so Jesus says it's better to let the darnel grow with the wheat for now. When the harvest came, it would be much easier to tell the two plants apart. One was destined for the master's storehouse, the other for a bonfire. So, like the parable of the sower, we don't have to guess what Jesus had in mind for the parable of the for this parable when he spoke to the people. In Matthew 13, 36 through 43, Jesus actually spells out the whole thing to the disciples when they came back and talked to him. He left the crowds and went into the house, and then as his disciples came to him saying, "Explain to us the parable of the darnel in the field," he answered, "The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed are the people of the kingdom. The poisonous weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest at the end is at the end of the age, and the reapers are angels. As the poisonous weeds are collected and burned with the fire, so will it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send his angels. They will gather from his kingdom everything that causes sin, as well as all lawbreakers. They will throw them into the fiery furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun from the kingdom of their Father. The one who has ears better listen." So this brings up an interesting point about parables. There are points past which you really can't push the analogy. In this parable, tares would never become wheat, and wheat would never become tares. But in the real world, the whole point behind the wheat is to turn more tares into wheat, right? That's what we're there for. It's our job to go out and give that message, that gospel, and turn the bad into the good. So people who had never heard about a gospel until an advanced age can still hear the gospel and obey. Conversely, those who have heard and known the gospel can consciously remove themselves from the church, and there's nothing we can do to bring them back without their cooperation. So he gave them another parable, and in this case it's about a mustard seed. He gave them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. It's the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest garden plant. It becomes a tree, so that wild birds come and nest in its branches. So, if you look there, the mustard seeds are they're just a little bit smaller than the peppercorn you'd find in a pepper grinder in your kitchen. But the full-grown mustard plants, depending on the species and variety, can hit up to 20 some odd feet tall. So technically they're just big bushes and not trees, but I'm being pedantic because my wife is a biologist. But still, they're easily big enough for a bird to come out and nest in the bushes and the branches of those mustard plants. So how is this like the kingdom of heaven? Well, the kingdom started out about the size of a mustard seed. In 3 BC, it was exactly the size of one small male baby. Over 30 years, it had started to grow, but was still fairly small. If you look at the secular history of the world at that point, in the mid-30s AD, Christ and his followers were only a minor nuisance to the local religion in one of the more backwater areas of the Roman Empire. The Jewish historian Josephus only mentions Jesus twice, I think, in passing, if you ever read any of his histories. However, in the roughly 2,000 years since then, the kingdom of heaven has grown so large that there are few areas left on earth that haven't heard of it, and we're doing our best to get to them as quickly as possible. And that's the whole point behind the missionaries that we send around the globe. In Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission says that we're to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them everything that Christ has commanded us. Now for the fun one. This one's only one verse long, or 2 verses if you go with the version in Luke. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed with 3 measures of flour until all the dough had risen. So you look at this, and there are a couple of different ways that you can go with it. In the studying that I did for the lesson, there are kind of 2 modes of thought for this, I guess you could say. There's the positive interpretation. And this interpretation makes sense in a lot of ways. The parable immediately follows the parable of the yeast in both Matthew and Luke. So it's not unreasonable to see a tie-in between the 2 of them. We noted in the parable of the mustard seed, or as we noted in the parable of the mustard seed, the kingdom of heaven started out as one newborn boy in Bethlehem, and that was pretty small. Now we're getting even smaller. Yeast is so small that they're invisible to human eyes, an individual yeast cell. Yet if you give yeast water and sugar to grow on, they'll grow and grow and ultimately make the dough expand to twice the original size. And those measures mentioned in the parable, a single measure is over 16 pounds. So when you're talking 3 measures of wheat, you're talking almost 50 pounds of wheat by itself, not counting the leaven and the rest. So it's going to take a little while also for that yeast to do its work. I have a recipe for no-knead bread that only contains flour, water, yeast, and a tiny bit of salt. But the key to that recipe is that once you start it, you have to leave it on the countertop untouched for a minimum of 18 hours before you bake it. Otherwise, it will just kind of turn into a bread pancake. And it won't rise at all, and it'll be ugly. So finally, for the yeast, there's not a lot that goes into a loaf of bread, maybe a couple of tablespoons per loaf, but that yeast grows and divides and grows and divides until it completely permeates that loaf of bread. Like the way the church grows, we're not trying to immediately change the world, but we're trying to change that one person who changes another person, who changes another person, who changes more people. Slide 20, or this slide, this interpretation is almost diametrically opposed to the first, in that the yeast is the presence of sin or Satan in this interpretation. In some ways, this makes almost as much sense, and this may actually be one of those parables that can ultimately be interpreted or give you at least cause for thought both ways. But Satan's influence in a church can start out infinitesimally small. Minor changes to something that one of the apostles or even Jesus had said. Just like it was in Genesis, chapter 2 in the Garden of Eden, when Eve made that one little misstatement, that one little addition to what God had told her to do, and that gave the serpent an opening. If you'll remember, under Mosaic law, the nation of Israel was to purge their homes of all leaven or yeast during the first Passover. And in the law for the priests, and that was in Exodus 12, verse 15, and the command was driven home on Mount Sinai in Exodus 34:25, and in the law for the priests in Leviticus 10:12. Later in the New Testament, Paul uses the illustration of yeast and dough at least twice, and in both instances, he's using this very sense here. So yeah, those are the verses. So anybody, I'm seeing picture snapping. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, as he's discussing discipline in the church and says sexual immorality is present in some members of the congregation, he says, "Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast leavens the whole batch of dough? Clean out the old yeast so that you may be a new batch of dough. You are, in fact, without yeast. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. So then, let us celebrate the festival, not with the old yeast, the yeast of vice and evil, but with the bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth." And in Galatians chapter 5, Paul was taking the Galatian church to task, as some were teaching that the men of the congregation had to be circumcised and obey the law. Paul argues strenuously against that, and in verse 9 says that a little yeast makes the whole batch of dough rise. So there are sound arguments to both sides on this, and this is one of those instances actually where both can be true. And both points are valid and may be true, but you're going to be the one that has to think about that for yourself. The next parable concerns a lamp and what we do with lamps. He also said to them, "A lamp isn't brought to be put under a basket or under a bed, is it? It's to be placed on a lampstand. For nothing is hidden except to be revealed, and nothing concealed except to be brought to the light. If anyone has ears to hear, he better listen." And he said to them, "Take care about what you hear. The measure you use will be the measure you receive, and more will be added to you. For whoever has will be given more, but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him." So we've got kind of two thoughts in this passage here. The first thought is that in a lot of instances, we are the light of the world, and we are the only Bible the world will ever read, as that song puts it. We're there to, Christ bought us with his blood. He didn't buy us to hide us away. He bought us for us to display the light that we have within us, that light of his kingdom that's burning. As a lamp, we don't choose what and where we wish to shine. We're shining everywhere at all times without fear or favor. And verse 24 appears to be a parallel of Matthew 7 and 14. Take care of what you hear. The measure you use will be the measure you receive, and more will be added to you. So that's an injunction against judgment. 7:15 says, "Do not judge so that you will not be judged. For by the standard you judge, you will be judged, and the measure you use will be the measure you receive. Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye, but fail to see the beam of wood in your own? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me remove the speck from your eye,' where the beam is in your own? You hypocrite, first remove the beam from your own eye, and then you can see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." So the second half of this was a little harder for me to reason out. Because when you think about it, most of the time when we're talking about people having things, it's a situation where those who are wealthy have enough and they're supposed to be giving to the ones who don't have anything or don't have much. But after looking at it, it seemed to me to be a combination of warning against, let's see, where was that? Oh, sorry. It was the same thing as the parable of the talents, where the single talent was given to from the unfaithful slave that was given to the slave to begin with. When that slave gave it back to the master was not pleased that that talent had not grown, while the unfaithful slave had it, and so took it from the slave and gave it to the one who had 10. So that kind of appears here at the end of this passage. For whoever has will be given more, but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. So if we don't use that light that we're given, that light's going to be taken from us, and we're not going to be able to do anything good with it. So the last parable that we're going to talk about here was not in my original list, but it fit so well that I figured I'd try and sneak it in, and we're not too far over time. So I don't know how many of you here are members of the VFW, but if you've ever been to a meeting in the VFW, in the middle of the meeting, there is a spot where the meeting stops and a collection is taken up. The VFW runs a children's home in Eaton Rapids, Michigan, and a collection is taken up to send specifically to that children's home. And as part of that, there's a prayer that goes along with it that actually quotes this passage in Matthew 19:14. Now, people were bringing little children to him for him to touch, but the disciples scolded those who brought him. But when Jesus saw this, he was indignant and said to them, "Let the little children come to me. Do not try to stop them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I tell you the truth, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child will never enter it." And as he took the children in his arms, he placed his hands on them and blessed them. Jesus was indignant. Jesus isn't indignant too many times in the scriptures. And he kind of spanked his disciples' hands verbally, and he said, "I tell you the truth, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like this child will never enter it." So how do you receive the kingdom of God like a child? This is going to be something I'm going to kind of gloss over and give to everyone as homework to do some studying on, because we don't have time to finish the rest of it off. But when children love or receive something, first off, their reactions, their gratitude are 100% genuine. For the 3, 4, 5, 6-year-olds in here, if you say, "On the way home from church today, we're going to stop by Varsities and get them donuts," I will guarantee you that joy will be unalloyed. That will be happy joy. When you're that age, there's no halfway, right? When you accept something, when you do something, when you go out to play, when you go eat lunch, when you go take a bath, you're all in 100%. It's not how much can I get away with, or how much do I have to do. Well, some of it is, if they don't want to do it, but usually if they're in on it, they're in all the way, right? So when you look at all of the people that were around Jesus at this point on his day-to-day mission, and the way that they were, it's really cool to listen to you, but I'd really like some of that healing stuff. Now, if you could go ahead and heal this problem I've had, that'd be great. I could see how having an opportunity to deal with children and the purity of purpose, the purity of motive, and the purity of the love I could see how he would look at that as a beautiful and refreshing thing. So there are a lot of things that the kingdom of heaven is like. From my talks with my other Christian brothers and sisters, for every one of us, the kingdom of heaven is different in a way. None of us have the same experience. It's certainly hard to describe, even to myself sometimes, what the kingdom of heaven is like. It certainly makes sense that Christ used the parables that we've talked about today as a way to describe that wonder, and at least as a way to get people started on it. But as part of the invitation, I'd like to acknowledge that we, a lot of times in the Church of Christ, not pointing fingers here in the congregation or anywhere else, but I've seen it kind of in general, that we too have the vices of our virtues. We say that the path to salvation is to hear the word. Believe it, repent, confess, be baptized, and live faithfully. That's true as far as it goes, right? But these steps, while they have to be done in order, you don't have to complete one to go to the next. The point here is that if you're still out of the church, if you're unbaptized, a lot of times when you sit in here and you listen to these lessons, you think, I've got to get myself cleaned up morally, mentally, spiritually, before I can come to God and present myself to Christ to become a member of the church. Nothing is further from the truth. It's the baptism, it's the life afterward. It's the prayer, the supplication, the encouragement and the help from your brothers and sisters that are going to help you take care of the problems, spiritually, morally, that you've got. So please, right now, if you're not in here, Christ is right next to you telling you he loves you and he wants you in here. So please don't ignore that voice as we stand and sing the invitation song.
All things are ready.